everybody welcome Derek Johnson.
Thank you. There's a lot of other things you could be doing with your time tonight than coming to hear me talk on behalf of AE911truth.org, and I appreciate that. Like Joe said, I'm an engineer. I've been in the practice for about 4 years of experience. I've worked on approximately 250 structures in various degrees, from design to inspections, field inspections, inspecting damage, structural failures at some point, none on the magnitude of 9/11. But I want to go over a few things that I feel are pertinent and necessary to educate the public on what to expect of a real investigation, because up to this point we have not had a real 9/11 investigation. And I want to thank Mr. Peglow for correcting me on that earlier. Okay, why do this? I have a belief system, and my belief is in God. And I believe that God gives me some strength to do the things that I do every day. Not all of this material is going to be faith-based. This material that I'm going to go over is based on fact, based on what we know. And this is what motivates me personally. I think our God wants justice. I think our God wants truth. On a secular level, let me read one slide. I won't read many of these slides, but I do want to read this because I think this wisdom's eternal. Society lives and acts only in individuals. It is nothing more than a certain attitude on their part. Everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others. And no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone in his own interest must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle. This is the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. An economist, perhaps the smartest man of our time, Ludwig von Mises. So what are the consequences historically, politically, the aftermath of 9/11? They are manifold. We've had 2 invasions in Iraq, an untold amount of economic, monetary, and other consequences, perhaps future retaliation that we as of yet are completely unaware of. Depreciation of our dollar. Partially, this is to blame for shortcomings in our economic situation. Executive orders, a complicit media, policy of torture, legislation to diminish civil liberties, Bill of Rights, draining of our treasury, creation of a Department of Homeland Security, and a global war on terror, a war on a tactic. Many Americans believe that 9/11 has some complicit issues. The government was, our president was briefed in the beginning of August regarding possible plane attacks to buildings. And many Americans are aware of this and becoming increasingly aware of this. According to certain polls, many Americans want Congress to probe the president and vice president. Well, that didn't happen. Not to our satisfaction. The testimony was off record. So, fortunately, there are a lot of architects, engineers, pilots, first responders, medical professionals, lawyers, American citizens, and other citizens around the world who want answers. We're petitioning Congress. We know that's probably in vain, but we're doing it anyway. At the end of the day, it's up to you, it's up to me to get to the bottom of 9/11. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was approximately 357 architects and engineers registered that were on board with ae911truth.org. Today, well, last week, there were 716. I think today there's 718. So let's talk about the scientific method, or the lack thereof, in these so-called investigations up to this point. The scientific method has been our very definition of science for quite a period of time. Formulating questions, performing observations, research, constructing hypotheses, making predictions, testing with experiments, analyzing data, results, drawing conclusion. Hypothesis is corroborated. Hypothesis is not corroborated. Reporting the results. Has there been corroboration with 9/11? Do we all agree? Everyone, every American agree on the events of 9/11? Well, those first few polls, I said, indicate that no. There is no corroboration at this point. There is no agreement. Therefore, this continues. Sure, they want voices like mine and like yours snuffed away, but they're not going anywhere. Now, looking at various buildings that are undergoing different sorts of trauma, we have fires, we have controlled demolitions, earthquakes, explosions, and all these phenomena can cause building damage. But the extent of how much and how we simulate building damage is part of my purpose for coming here and speaking. John Barnett with FEMA made a statement that's interesting to me, perhaps to you, and that is, until 9/11, I have not seen a protected steel structure collapse in a fire. So this event's unprecedented. First ever steel frame building to collapse at near free fall speed due to fire. Here's some buildings that have collapsed. And you can see that these buildings do not resemble the aftermath of the World Trade Center structures. They don't resemble them in the least bit. They fell over, presumably favoring an injury on one side of the building or another, or a weakness on one side of the building or the other. None of them fell in their own footprint. Typical controlled demolition characteristics: sudden onset, straight down collapse, demolition waves, free fall speed, or near free fall speed, total dismemberment of members, minimal damage to adjacent structures, sounds of flashes and explosives, pulverized concrete, squibs, and perhaps chemical evidence of cutter charges and or other explosives. Now, going through each one of these, let's look and see if this is supported scientifically for one building and one building only. Some of these pictures have cleanup of other buildings, but the main building, the main thrust of my talk, I want to be on World Trade Center, Building 7. Quick story, when I was at UTA as an undergrad on September 11th of 2001, September 12th of 2001, I had some professors, PhDs in engineering, other students, and we all remarked at the speed of the falls. None of us would think that the government would ever do or be complacent in such a thing. None of us, but all of us were so amazed at such a sudden drop of such powerful and massive structures designed for one thing, and that's to resist the force of gravity. Yet it's gravity that supposedly caused this collapse. Well, I still didn't believe my government would ever do such a thing. And I was not aware of World Trade Center 7 until a couple of years after the collapse. I got an email from another engineer. Look at this. Did you know about this one? No. I was ignorant for a long time with 9/11. And I was told by PhD structural engineers right when it happened that there was something wrong. Took me a while to wise up. Takes everyone a while to wise up sometimes. But now that some of us are getting wiser, let's open this up. WTC 7 is a small structure compared to the Twin Towers, World Trade Center 1 and 2. Yet it would be a very large structure in most cities, even Dallas. 610 feet standing building. Not hit by an airplane. Now there was a lot of theories on why it fell. Official 9/11 story trademark theories. Many conflicting stories. It was situated well north of the North Tower, 110 yards from the North Tower. It was hit by debris from the North Tower and collapsed 7 hours. After the collapses. Now we know about the fires in the buildings because there's plenty of photographic evidence of fires throughout the day. And doing, I suppose, shadow analysis, we can pinpoint the times in which these fires occurred. And we can also, after the fact, do reverse analysis. And using a topic that I'm going to bring up towards the end of this presentation, using finite element analysis, using classical equations, we can determine and we can predict how much energy will be imparted from fires through fireproofing to the members that the fireproofing is applied to, and how much thermally these members will expand. And then I want to get to the key principal element of what the NIST report from 2008 is telling me and you, and that is enough fire caused large floor beams to detach from columns, tearing away from the columns, and somehow columns became free for many floors, and that caused a cascading sequence in which the building fell at near free fall speed, giving no resistance over 7 or 8 floors from from 7 WTC floor 7 to 14, no resistance in 2.25 seconds, a virtual free fall speed. So floors happened on buildings, WTC 7, floor 7, 8, 12, 13. This is 4:45 in the afternoon. And you can see the fires coming out the window. Now the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, submitted by Chris Sarnes, modeled the fires on floor 12. That's consistent with photographs. Now, modeling fires can be done a different amount of ways. The technology that is available to us that I want to see utilized by engineers, architects, and other people that are interested, curious, and motivated to get to the bottom of this is finite element analysis. There are many different software programs that have this ability to determine how much heat can get transferred from office fires, which are burning what? Carpet, computers, coffee cups, books, papers. And then they have to move on. When they're done, you need a fuel source and you need oxygen, which is available in the air. So you see there is a progression here. It moves around, moves around, moves around. The fire has to move. But at the bottom line of my presentation, I want to get to that column on 79. Was there enough to heat up those structural members that were fireproofed to rip those floor beams away from the columns and make a column stand free all by itself, unsupported, and make, therefore, an entire building collapse at near free fall speed? Now, at different times here, we see a fire growing, developing, and it has to. Fires are organic. They have to move on. Fires have to find new fuel to consume. A fire can't be stagnant and steady in one place unless more and more fuel is provided to the fire. So what is finite element method analysis? Some people call it FEM, some people call it FEA. Why is it important in regards to 9/11? Well, because it can substantiate what they're telling us. It can prove or disprove these reports they keep releasing to us. The stories change. Whatever they want to say, I'm sure is going to corroborate Osama bin Laden from a cave with 19 hijackers did all this damage. Well, I want the public to have the evidence presented to them that shows, yes, that's true, or no, that's not true. And obviously, to this point, we haven't had an investigation, not a real investigation. So, let's look at the overall design idea of World Trade Center 7. And I pulled this out of New York Times, Sunday, February 19th from 1989, in which Larry Silverstein was saying it was a strong building. It was overbuilt. It was built with the intention of opening up floors later on for tenants who wanted to open up floors and have double space floors. But despite all that, we put in 375 more tons of steel. That required 12 miles of welding to reinforce some of these tenants' demands of opening up floors. So he's saying the building was over-designed in the first place. But to satisfy our tenants' needs, we over-designed it and overbuilt it even more 3 to 4 years after the fact, after the building was built. And I believe it was completed in 1987, and it was upgraded in 1990. But then the 2008 NIST report. Because of differences between their structural design and their being these 3 other structures, and that of WTC-7, these 3 buildings did not collapse. Because of differences between structural design. That's saying that this building is of an insufficient or marginal design. But the building owner said it was a strong design, and despite of that, they made it even stronger anyway. So yet we have another contradiction. Page 48 of the NIST report from 2008, this was the first known instance where fire-induced local damage led to the collapse of an entire tall building. Also from 48, even without the initial structural damage caused by the debris impact from the collapse, WTC-1, Building 7 would have collapsed from the fires having the same characteristics as those experienced on 9/11/01. They're giving you nonsense in their report, and this is the official story that you're supposed to swallow. And then earlier on we heard from debunking websites and so on and so forth that diesel fires provided enough fuel to melt those structural elements or expand the structural elements to the point that they would break away from their column connections. Now these are connections that I design, inspect, and this is my living and the living of some others in this room. And I want to tell you, this is an unlikely event. This is an extremely unlikely event. Do we American citizens have probable cause to demand a real 9/11 investigation? Well, we know our government's not going to do it, so ultimately that's going to come upon us, including peer-reviewed FEA, among others, and forensic studies, or scaled-down models. Or must we accept what hand-picked paid experts opine? I won't read all of this, but this is a statement by a physicist who put forward a lot of physical evidence, 9/11, WTC-7. Now imagine if you're a police officer and your job's to enforce the law, and you put your blue and reds on somebody and you approach the car, and you see a bloody knife laying in the passenger seat. You hear moaning and groaning coming from the trunk and someone barely able to talk saying, "Help, help, help." Now you're going to pull out your duty weapon and you're going to put it on that person behind the wheel, and you're going to tell them to get out and get on the ground and keep your hands where you can see them. Well, you're not. He doesn't have to have probable cause if a police officer sees evidence of a crime. I believe, and many others believe, there is an evidence of a crime, of a murder times 3,000. And I'm motivated to do something about it. So are many others. We do have probable cause. Eyewitnesses of the controlled demolition, city workers, Barry Jennings, videotaped statements of firefighters backing people away prior to the collapse of Building 7, videotaped evidence of a countdown prior to Building 7, audio explosions heard by eyewitnesses What else do we have in terms of probable cause? Well, easier to refute, but nevertheless evidence we call anecdotal. Larry Silverstein's statements. Pull it. Barry Jennings and Hess arrived at the emergency offices of emergency management, floor 23, at building 7 at 9 o'clock. They found it empty. It was evacuated at 9 o'clock. $13 million was expended to create this impregnable floor, and it was upgraded in 1990, even though it didn't need to be upgraded in 1990, according to the owner's statement. But the towers had not fallen, yet everyone was evacuated from Building 7. The food and coffee showed the occupants had left in a hurry. Then Jennings made a phone call and was told he must get out of there. This building didn't get hit by a plane, nor did any other building besides the two twin towers. And this is post-plane strike. Post-one plane strike. Why? The only plausible answer is that pre-demolition blasts were about to begin, which he testified to. And then the BBC at 5 o'clock and CNN before lunch had early announcements of the complete collapse of WTC 7. And they haven't been explained. Oh, they apologized for the confusion, for the mistake, but they didn't have good answers for those misfires early before the building fell. And then there's more circumstantial evidence. There's tons of circumstantial evidence. Enough to have us here tonight, instead of watching Hollywood's latest and greatest, asking these questions. How? Why? Who? What do we know? Now, this is often used to debunk 9/11 quote-unquote conspiracy theorists, a pejorative that hasn't been in our vernacular for more than one generation. And they say, you see all this damage? That's a lot of damage. Must fall. So I would think that this kind of damage would make a fall go that way. Like that building. I would imagine it had damage on this side, or weakness on that side, and it favored its injury. So let's go through this hypothetical. Could this be a controlled demolition? Could it be an implosion like the early FEMA report on WTC 7? Was there evidence of a sudden onset at the base of the structure? Was there? Well, an emergency worker said a sound of a clap of thunder, shockwave ripping through the building, windows bursting out. On an interview. Was there a straight down collapse, or did it favor an injury in the southwest corner? This southwest corner. No. It was a straight down collapse. Dan Rather's statement was interesting to me. It was an honest statement. It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television, where a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down. Looks that way to me too, Mr. Rather. It was a straight down and symmetrical collapse, suggesting symmetrical damage, suggesting uniform damage. And there she goes. Now this is what NIST has given us to look at and to bow to and worship. Now you see some elements in here, some elements that are grossly distorted, but it was this area of this building that gave absolutely no resistance for 2.25 seconds. It was like this wasn't there. Now, I'm not an expert on buckling theory, and a lot of our buckling theory comes from a German named Euler. And his equations, which we now numerically integrate in computer software, are what's used in a lot of buckling theory equations. Buckling takes time. Buckling's not easy, especially when you're dealing with members an inch or thick more. But what we're supposed to believe is that somehow these members that they're showing that are grossly deformed offered no resistance for 2.25 seconds. An amazing leap of faith. And there it is, not favoring the injury in the southwest corner, but falling straight down in 6.5 seconds into its own footprint. One more time. No favoritism towards the injury in the southwest corner, straight down, no resistance, complete free fall, as if in a vacuum for 2.25 seconds. Now, a thought experiment that I've seen that's interesting is imagine we go above floor 14 and we have the rest of the building suspended by a crane. And then imagine a crane's holding another building from the top, 47th floor, down to floor 14, but it has the rest of the building below it. The first building has nothing below floor 14, being suspended by a crane. The second crane is holding up a cut building, cut just above floor 14. And both are released. Which will hit first? Well, I would think the one with no building beneath it would hit first. But they land at the same time. How'd that happen? Demolition waves. Remove column support is how it has to happen. There ain't no other way. 23 core columns all at once. Now these cores are large structural members. They're members I haven't dealt with personally. I haven't dealt with AISC, American Institute of Steel Construction, jumbo shapes. Shapes that are 500 pounds a foot, 600 pounds a foot, 1,000 pounds a foot. The core of this building was made with such members that will greatly resist the force of gravity. Now here's the magic column, column 79. The Achilles heel, I'm told to believe, of World Trade Center 7. The working hypothesis is based on an initial local failure caused by normal building fires, not diesel fuels for the generators. Debunking websites love to point out it was diesel fuel. It was diesel fuel. That did it. It fed the fire, weakened the beams deflected from the heat, and the whole thing just came down. Now again, the building owner, and I'm repeating this point, but it's an important one, the building owner at one point spoke in a way of just overflowing puffery to the New York Times of how strong his building was, the Salomon Brothers building, how over-designed it was, how it was designed with the intention of opening up at different points per the whim of its tenants. But then they further upgraded it to withstand the opening of floors anyway, despite all that. Yet NIST tells us bad design. Now here's rare access to the inside of Building 7 at the magic column. And here's the magic point of the magic column, in which fire in an office burned so intensively at one place for so long that it went through the fireproofing and went into the metal and heated it up and expanded it and tore it away from its moment connection here at the column. Now each one of these floors is 4 inches to 5 inches thick, of 3,000 to 4,000 pounds per square inch concrete that gets stronger with time. And inside that concrete, we're going to have rebar or post-tension tendons, rebar every 12 to 18 inches typically, number 3, number 4, number 5, don't know, can't know, want to know, each way. So we have a lot of steel in these floors. It's not going to want to move away from this column. Not to mention, we'll have perimeter angles all around the outside, holding that post-tension tendon reinforced or rebar reinforced concrete in place. Not to mention, we have other, look at this, this building doesn't have floor joists, it has something even stronger. It has girders, I-beams. This is a dream when it comes to building construction. We use floor joists to save money. No expense was spared here, apparently, from this picture by Mr. Silverstein, and he said as much to the New York Times. Yet we're to believe that enough thermal energy entered these beams to rip this floor beam away from this column. And it said unattached for four stories, so this column continuing, this floor beam continuing along the other side of the column also ripped apart. And this somehow ripped off, and this somehow ripped off. And this concrete, it all got ripped away from this column somehow because they make the statement unsupported. That column 79 was unsupported. You can't unsupport that column from fire. Free fall speed through path of greatest resistance, which I mentioned with the thought of experiment. You have a crane holding floors 15 to 47 with nothing below floor 15. You have another crane holding floors 47 to 15 cut at the bottom of 15. And then below the cut, you have the remainder of the building over here. Nothing under floor 15 here. The building cut under floor 15 here. Both of the tops of the buildings being supported by cranes. The crane drops both, in which will land first. The one with no building underneath will land first, but that's not what happened. They land at the same time on 9/11. So we have, fortunately, many people looking at the video evidence and applying the physics, Newton's laws of motion, to the free fall collapse video evidence. And what we find out is below floor 15 for 2.25 seconds, absolutely no resistance was given to the upper portion of that building. Were they removed by fire, the columns, the structural members? Or were they removed by explosives? One more time. I know I'm beating this one to death. But it's important that we see this and ask, do we believe what the experts tell us, or do we believe our lying eyes? Well, this physicist plots that we have approximately free fall speed. And I like debunking logic. Early on we heard free fall speed. And it's true that NIST admitted just last year that for 2.25 seconds of the fall, yes, in fact, free fall speed was achieved. But someone that doesn't like our viewpoint, and our viewpoint is this, is that these investigations are not investigations. They're shams to support a predetermined conclusion. They'll say, it fell at 6.8 seconds, not 6.7. Ha! You're wrong. An unfair comparison. So it walks like a controlled demolition. It talks like a controlled demolition. It smells like a controlled demolition. But of course it wasn't a controlled demolition. No. Controlled demolition on the right. Likely controlled demolition on the left. Is this unfair? Now here's the magic 8 stories that gave no resistance. No resistance. Not minimal resistance. None. B disappeared. There was thousands of tons of structural steel and concrete. And it gave no resistance. All of the gravitational potential energy of section C is converted into kinetic energy per the law of conservation of energy law. So it got violated. I don't think you can violate those laws of thermodynamics and physics. No one has yet. Yet on 9/11/2001 they were. Here's some of the members of the inner core of World Trade Center 7. And you can see the web address at the top. And if you've worked with these buildings before, you'll notice something about Series 14 W-shaped I-beams. And if these were on the outer exterior portion of the building, we may call it a wind brace. And alternatively, you can put extra moment connections welded or bolted in, critical slip connections, etc. But what you'll notice is not the first part of this number of this 14 series I-beam, it's the second of this beam that's anticipated to act in compression predominantly. This second number means 655 pounds per foot. It's a lot of steel. Over here, a build-up member, 790 pounds per foot. And down here, another build-up member, acting in a beam fashion, 1,060 pounds per foot. This isn't going to want to fall. It won't fall easily. It takes a lot of work to get one of these to fall. Yet we're given this, gross distortions. Caused by what? Building 79 detaching because of office fires, because of burning, smoldering, smoking computers and coffee cups and books and papers and carpet and chairs and desks. Whatever a fire consumed did all this. Total dismemberment of the steel structure. This is a characteristic or an indicator of a controlled demolition. Did we have it? Yeah. We didn't have our long columns, our long floor beams. We had a piled up, neatly mess. I think at the highest point, 40 feet tall or so. There's a bus right here, maybe 50. Not very tall. It was 610 feet in the sky. Job well done. Now, if it had an injury in the southwest corner, then you would think it would topple. You'd think it would slough. It may fall a little bit if there's enough damage and then stop because of the laws of physics, conservation of energy, buckling theory. But no. Minimal damage to adjacent structures. Good job. Good job. Now this, I believe, was debris from the North Tower. And also that corroborates with the damage we saw in the southwest corner of Building 7. Sounds of explosives. Did people say they heard explosives? Well, a New York Office of Emergency Management eyewitness said he heard explosives in Building 7 before the collapses of WTC 1 and 2. And a police officer, boom, boom, boom. I think I know an explosion when I hear it. Police officer, first responder, ground zero worker who had to inhale all that dust that we were told was safe to inhale on the 16th by our EPA. Kevin McPadden, former Air Force Specialist Operations for Search and Rescue. He said he heard WTC explosions. And then the fire department. I guess the sound isn't on in this. Guess not. Is there a way to toggle up the sound? We'll find out. What this firefighter is telling this person here who's questioning what he said is, there's a bomb in the building. Start clearing out. And then the gentleman with the ponytail and the goatee said, what? And then the firefighter repeated himself. There's a bomb in the building. Clear out. What bomb? Who told him? Who knew? Let's try it again. I can...
Bomb in the building, start clearing out. Sorry, you said it's a bomb?
What'd you say?
Bomb in the building, start clearing out. Got it.
Y'all hear that okay? enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. Now you can make an argument, and it's a fair one, that gravity itself will cause dust when a structure collapses, such as in an earthquake. But here we have dust that goes to New Jersey. Pools of molten iron. This is the hardest thing I have in my mind to figure out. Pools of molten iron. First of all, most of this building is constructed with structural steel. The rebar on each of the 47 decks are going to be grade 40, grade 60, grade 75. I don't know. I need the construction contract documents to figure that out exactly. But they're going to be one of those three. The structural members are going to be ASTM 836. I know about how much that concrete is going to have in terms of its constituents, carbon, silicone, etc. It's going to be a low carbon, and we designed it that way. It's going to have a tensile strength of about 56,000 psi, and that's why we choose it, because it's soft. It will elongate 23 to 30% before it fails. It's an ideal building material because it's extremely strong, and it's extremely ductile and elastic, and allows for vibrations and so on and so forth. But how do you melt it? What do you mean pools of molten iron, which is steel is an iron derivative, a very low carbon iron, if you will. Steel was refined and developed about 150 years ago, and it's the ultimate building material. How do you melt steel? It's not easy. The oldest way, and that is the development of that technology, goes back to the Hittites, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ. And they figured out early on, using bellows, that they had to introduce a lot of oxygen, or air, the oxygen in air, to heat charcoal, petroleum coke, probably charcoal in that day, to get iron to melt. In a 10-inch cupola furnace, inside diameter of 10 inches, with tweezers 2.5 inches blowing air in, you need approximately 200 cubic feet per minute of air at all times continuously to heat inside a cupola furnace sequential layers of coke and steel, coke, steel, coke, steel. Office fires can't do that. The ignition temperature of most oil products is about 400 degrees, 500 degrees. If you have more air, you have more heat. And our welding cutting torches, acetylene, a very, very flammable gas, will burn at 5,600 degrees. But there's pressurized oxygen feeding the pressurized acetylene, and at the very tip we get a 5,600 degree burn. But notice, if you've ever welded or cut steel, your burning is very local to the kerf of your welding tip. Right at the end, 5,600 degrees. An inch away, slightly above room temperature. So there's three modes, and I don't want to get into heat transfer theory, but as far as my education, there's three modes. There's radiation, there's convection, and there's conduction. All three modes always play a part in the transfer of heat, but usually there's one predominant mode. But this one blows my mind. How did molten metal or molten steel get in there in the first place? Well, on WTC 1 and 2, there's steel coming out a building showing the videotape evidence, and the steel appears to be bright orange, which molten steel is if you're familiar with foundries. We have one in Jewett, Texas, Nucor Steel, and I have been in there, and I have seen molten steel. It's not this. It's what you see on the videotape. This is molten aluminum, and there's some controversy on molten aluminum versus molten steel in some of the reports of what's coming out of the buildings, WTC 1 and 2. Molten aluminum, silvery, and we do have a foundry in Fort Worth. You can go see what molten aluminum is, or you can just look at it here. It's silvery. Molten steel looks different. It's red, it's orange, it's very bright. Now here's a long litany of different people witnessing molten steel. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel still running. Leslie Robertson, structural engineer, responsible for the design of the WTC at the National Conference of Structural Engineers, on October 5, 2001. Is he a credible source? Oh yeah. Fires burned at molten, and molten metal flowed into the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet, according to New Jersey's Task Force 1 Urban Search and Rescue, Sarah Atlas. What did the first responders and demolition contractors say about molten metal? Well, Peter Tully saw pools of literally molten steel. President of Tully Construction in Flushing, lead contractor for site cleanup. Is that a credible source? Chaplain Herb Trimp, molten metal, beams had just totally been melted. Beams had just totally melted. John O'Toole, a Bronx firefighter, it was dripping from molten steel. Reporter with rare access, steel flowed into molten streams. Allison G-E-Y-H, PhD. They are finding molten steel. A disaster relief veteran seeing molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams. By this time, you should be asking yourself, what on earth could cause molten steel to be there in the first place? Can burning office supplies cause molten steel? Thermite, maybe? Dr. Keith Eaton, ranging from molten metal, red hot, weeks after the event. That's suggesting chemical reaction, not some temporary taking a welding torch and running a cut. This is involving chemicals. Maybe thermite. Maybe. Guy Lonesbury of New York Air National Guard's 109th Air Wing. Molten steel at the heart of the towers remain. Firemen sprayed water to cool the debris, but the heat remained intense, enough at the surface to melt their boots. New York Department of Sanitation spokeswoman. Molten steel beams. Everything from molten steel beams to human remains for about 2.5 months after the attacks. American author and journalist William Langeweiss, the streams of molten metal that had leaked from the hot cores and flowed down broken walls inside the foundation hole. Boone County firefighter Lee Turner, seeing the darkness, a distant pinkish glow, molten metal dripping from a beam, but found no signs of life. This person, in the first few weeks, sometimes when a worker would pull a steel beam from the wreckage, the end of the beam would be dripping molten steel. I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center. Abul Hassan Astana As, the first structural engineer given access to WTC steel at Fresh Kills Landfill, National Science Foundation grant. Can gravity or coffee cups burning do this? Burning books in gravity, can it do this? Can it distort and eat up structural members in this manner? Can fires do that? 9/11 Commission report. The authors of the official 9/11 story, trademark. Numerous fires were still burning and smoldering. Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall from Building 6. Oops. Well, we appreciate the honesty. But how do you melt steel? How does molten steel get there? Richard Garlock, structural engineer with Leslie Robertson and Associates. Going below, it was smoky and really hot. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Massive heat source bends steel columns with no buckling. Again, with the columns attached at floor beams, north, south, east, and west at each intersection. And the floor beams attached to perimeter angle iron. And girders running every so often, building 7-10 feet or so from the picture. And concrete, all supporting a 4-inch, 5-inch slab of concrete which contains rebar every 12 inches. It detached from fire, and according to the pictures, it buckled. But the little diagram they give us, but on here we don't see buckling, we see massive amount of bending, massive heat sources, bend steel columns. Where'd all that heat come from? And notice the rust, or the corrosion here, and one might say, well, the rain, well, why isn't it uniformly corroding? Why is it corroding in these ends? And they were also saying that we brought up steel and molten metal was dripping from the ends. And now it's showing some indication of oxidation here. Vance Designor, OSHA officer at WTC, reporting to Jim McKay, Post-Gazette staff writer on September 11, 2002. A fire truck 10 feet below the ground that was still burning 2 weeks after the tower collapse. Its metal so hot that it looked like a vat of molten steel. Fireman and hazardous materials expert. Pieces of steel, still cherry red. And a letter from President Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. Molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are both videotape and still photos of molten steel being dipped out by buckets of excavators. Again, what could cause molten steel to be there in the first place? John Field, head of a great organization in support of the first responders. While the fire department was throwing water on the pile, the water would bounce back and burn us. That's how hot it was. In other words, it was vaporized. It was steamed by pouring water onto it. It's hot. How? Now we have this meteorite. 9/11 artifacts. Architect Bart Versanger discovers numerous multi-ton, previously molten meteorites in the World Trade Center rubble. And the good note, aluminum does not rust. Steel and a big massive something that was previously molten. And the thermal imagery from above corroborates reports of deep down molten metal, of so many witness statements by so many credible witnesses. Surface temperatures of this thermography, 1100 degrees, 1340, 1377. Goodness gracious, that's hot. Went way past Osama bin Laden's wildest expectations, I'm sure. The official reports by NIST, FEMA, and the 9/11 Commission omit any mention of the large quantities of molten metal observed in the basement areas of the Twin Towers and WTC 7. Why? Now here we can see the melting temperatures of different, solids at room temperature. Lead, aluminum. And now we have this. We'll match this. That's steel being pulled up out of the World Trade Center wreckage. Problem is, this is September 27th. Now, to get jet fuel to produce these high temperatures, at the same time, you'd have to have it pressurized, a controlled volume, a highly controlled volume, and a lot of oxygen introduced. It's called a blast condition. We need about 3,300 degrees Fahrenheit inside a cupola furnace, our oldest type of blast furnace, to create that melting condition, which even then melts slowly at 3,300 degrees, drips down into the bottom of a cupola furnace. So we can get hydrocarbons to melt, but we need a large and continuous source of fuel and oxygen. Where was the large source of fuel and oxygen 2 weeks after these buildings fell, and we're still seeing molten steel, red hot steel? How does that happen? Has anyone come up with any reasonable explanation for this? No. The answer is no. Liquid metal falling, glowing metal pipe, glowing metal, liquid metal falling, ambient lighting from main source, over 2 weeks after those planes hit. There again, who do we believe here? And don't believe me. Don't believe me. Just hear what I have to say. Do your own evidence, fact-checking, researching, gather your own evidence, and believe yourself. And who are you going to believe here? We have a date on this photograph, presuming it wasn't altered and is from a good source, that over 2 weeks after the fact, we're pulling up and seeing molten metal in the wreckage of World Trade Centers. Now, when confronted with this, John Gross, lead engineer of NIST reports, came to the University of Texas at Austin, and John Gross knew absolutely nobody, no eyewitnesses, nobody who has produced any of that. Never heard of it. Well, we showed him. A lot of people showed him. Does John Gross have an answer, an explanation, a reasonable explanation of how this got here 2 weeks after? No. The answer is no. Back to the good old scientific method. If the data doesn't support the fire hypothesis, well, just deny it exists. WTC basement fires defeat water. They steam water. Fires much worse after the collapse, suggesting chemicals. The last fire was not extinguished until, December 19th, 2001. Only 3 months after 9/11. Tom Manley, Fire Department, New York City. You couldn't even begin to imagine how much water was pumped in there. It was like you were creating a giant lake. Yeah, it's hard to get a chemical reaction to start once it stops, especially a thermite one. Thermite contains its own supply of oxygen. It will burn just as well underwater. Water sprayed on a thermite reaction instantly will be boiled into steam. You've heard of the different classifications of fire extinguishers, Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D. Why all those different classes? Because we have different types of fires. And can you take a fire extinguisher and extinguish a thermite reaction? No. Chemical evidence, and this is the biggie. This is the strongest forensic evidence we have to this date, and this is the one that nobody has a reasonable answer for. What is thermite? I'll spare you from reading all this, but thermite's been around for a while. It was developed by him, and the original application was making chromium and welding. It was used in field welding repairs. Remember, when the rail went across the Old West in the United States, it was mostly riveted, and since a lot of the rail that went across was public funded, not private funded, it was a mess, and they had to repair it, and thermite was a pre-welding technology used to make field repairs of rail. It found a suitable application in this, and then it went away. It's highly explosive, and it doesn't require oxygen. And once that reaction starts, as long as the reactants are present, good luck getting it out. Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? Well, it's one of our hypotheses. Section 12-4. Unusual residues could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST acknowledges that it did not look for such evidence. Well, if you don't test for something, you won't find it. That's convenient. Thermite reaction compounds used to ignite a fire produce a characteristic burn pattern. White ash, white, yellow, hot, liquid metal, intense white reaction zone, and leave behind a unique chemical evidence. Common elements such as iron. Now remember, this building was not mostly iron. This building was mostly structural steel. ASTM 36, very, very low carbon steel. But we recovered a lot of iron, suggesting that, well, carbon got introduced to that molten metal somehow. How? Here's a meteorite, one of these mysterious frozen, molten and then frozen chunks that Stephen Jones, a physicist from Brigham Young University, analyzed. And he did some electron microspectrography and looked closely at this and see if it matched any of the suspects that we would look for in some of these pyroclastic or thermitic reactions. The molten metal has abundant manganese, and it did in the very beginning when its developer developed it, and one of the purposes for it, one of the side benefits, was the production of these byproduct reactants such as chromium and manganese. So he rules out molten structural steel as a major component. The previous molten metal has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. The previous molten metal has manganese and fluorine in abundance. Manganese and fluorine, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is a sol-gel type thermite charges. Hence, when we look at the evidence and it points to, well, it quacks, it wobbles, has web feet, we tend to believe it's a duck. Iron aluminum rich microspheres, did we find that in the dust? That dust is widely available. And yes, to get iron spheres, you almost have to reasonably conclude that it was either vaporized or molten at one point, and surface tension brought it into a sphere. Pulling a magnet across the outside of the plastic bag, dust was taken and dust was analyzed. Using X-ray energy dispersive spectrography, the presence of metallic microspheres implies that these metals were once molten or vaporized so that the surface tension pulled the droplets into a roughly spherical shape. Surface tension or capillary action are usually one of the two behaviors of liquids. They either want to cling to themselves, mercury, or cling to, through capillary action, whatever's containing the liquid. Well, steel has a tendency when it becomes molten, as does mercury, as do most metals, to cling to themselves, high amounts of surface tension. Then the molten droplets solidified in air. Spheres found in the WTC dust. So again, we have evidence of melting, of these chemical reactions of these, or at least, at the very least, extremely high sources of heat. Now, did we get characteristics of using our analysis of iron, aluminum, manganese, the usual suspects in thermite? Yeah, we get those characteristics. Look at our control, look at our test, and pretty good matchup. So there's a signature of walks like a duck, quacks, maybe it's a duck. Corroboration by USGS EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has begun a reassessment of the presence of World Trade Center dust. Good. Various metals, most notably iron and lead, were melted during the WTC event. WTC Signature Report, Deutsche Bank, December 2003. Producing spherical metallic particles, exposures of phases to high heat results in the formation of spherical particles due to surface tension. Metals have that. They want to stick to themselves instead stick to other things when they're in their molten form. And here we are, a ways away, evidence of high temperature corrosion on the tops of these cars. 1,000 cars near the World Trade Center, 2001. Long ways away, that to me is not the blazing New York City sun, that's something chemical. This corrosion occurred on the car tops, yet the paint was reasonably intact where this stuff didn't settle. What caused all that paint to corrode and rust so rapidly? To me, it's suggesting chemicals. To others, it's suggesting chemicals. Walk like a duck, talk like a duck. Quack like a duck. Web feet. Feathers. Given the mix of trace metals present in anomalously high concentrations of WTC dust such as zinc, copper, and manganese, and the formations of iron aluminum rich spherules, it is clear that the significant aluminum otheric reactions occurred, with likely ingredients to include powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, zinc nitrates, and potassium permanganate, again suggesting thermite, or maybe a more sophisticated version of thermite, which ranges in applications to re-welding the rail across the Old West to rocket fuel. And here we have Los Alamos National Laboratory having a patent on nanoparticle thermite, nanothermite. Direct evidence of explosive destruction, no characteristic of a destruction by fire. So do we have a controlled demolition? Experts said no building like it in a modern steel-framed high-rise has ever collapsed because of a fire. Here's some fires. Here's some steel-framed buildings. August 1970, 50-story building burned for 6 hours over 5 floors, no collapse. May 88, Los Angeles, 62 building burned for 3.5 hours over 5 floors, no collapse. February 91, Philadelphia, 38-story building burned for 18 hours over 8 floors, no collapse. October 2004, Caracas, Venezuela, 56-story building burned for 17 hours over 26 floors, no collapse. And this is World Trade Center 5. Roast some serious marshmallows and weenies in there. Did this building collapse? No collapse. And here's my favorite. This was around the Chinese New Year this year. And boy, let me tell you, they know how to bring in the new year. The Chinese know how to party. This 44-story Mandarin Oriental high-rise hotel burned on every floor with flames 30 feet in the air, gutted by fire. No collapse. And the next day. But fire brought down World Trade Center 7. So, data from FEMA and NIST reports. Official investigations into the WTC collapses. 2001, American Society of Civil Engineers, volunteers, in quotes, heavily dependent on federal government contracts. 2002, FEMA, $600,000 in funding, not much. Turned the American Society of Civil Engineers investigation into an assessment. Gotta love word games. Report released 2002, FEMA report. And they changed their minds on some things, but no big deal. This caused Building 7 to collapse. No, now that caused. Now this caused. Now that caused Building 7 to collapse. The latest is office fires. 2002, the building owner sponsored a report. He had billions to collect. 2005, NIST, 3-year, $20 million funding. Whew! Well, they should be able to get to the bottom of that with $20 million. And the report's not still pending. The report was released a couple months ago. And I'll put some of this report in these slides. Now, government documentation. The same experts keep showing up on different events, different groups. We see the same faces. We read the same names. We hear from the same organizations with the same government contracts. Evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including rapid oxidation and sulfidation with subsequent intergranular melting, was readily visible in the near-surface microstructure. No mention of that in this report. A liquid eutectic meaning the liquidus limit. When iron becomes liquid, it reaches a liquidus line of binary compounds, like iron is mostly iron and carbon is main constituent of interest. Anyway, when it approaches that melting point or eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on steel, no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. Was it the gypsum in the drywall sheetrock, as some say, that debunked this? No, that wouldn't attack that. It cannot attack it. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation discussing the sulfidation and oxidation, yet ignored by NIST. Sulfur is used with thermite to cut fast through steel, and it does a good job of that. It can also take you to the moon. Forensic metallurgy. Intergranular melting capable of turning solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. How does that happen? Can a plane do that? Can an office fire do that? Can gravity do this to structural components? Can gravity and office fires do this to remains of structural components? We have 6 engineers and architects in here. Can gravity and office fire do this? Can it bring members that were an inch thick down to, at the tip, 32nd thick? Can office fires do this to structural members? 1 inch thick column reduced to, what's this, 1/8? 2/8, quarter, down to the tip. Once again, evidence of chemicals or extreme high heat sources. NIST scientific method. Oh, it's a good one. Sarcasm. If the data, FEMA's Appendix C, doesn't support the fire hypothesis, hide it. Official FEMA report states the collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting an internal failure and implosion. Oh yeah, I agree with that. FEMA reports 2002 authors conclude the specifics of the fires in WTC 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain an unknown at this time. Also, the best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. So, once we analyze the data and results, and we can't really come up with an answer that supports the predetermined answer. If the conclusion doesn't support the hypothesis, punt. FEMA casts doubt on their own fire collapse theory and orders destruction of the evidence. Further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. In other words, we're not going to answer that question. We don't know. Unfortunately for investigators hoping to resolve this issue, much of the evidence has already been destroyed by FEMA. Fox guarding the henhouse. FEMA's destruction of evidence, largely recycled. Structural engineer from Houston told me there's about 100,000 tons of missing steel. How do you miss 100,000 tons? That's enough to make an aircraft carrier. Well, what they did have looks like they recycled. Up to 400 trucks per day removed all but 236 pieces of steel from the crime scene, effectively scrubbing it. Yeah, there's probable cause. If I was a cop, I would pull out my duty pistol and put it on that person with the bloody knife in the passenger seat and hearing moans and groans from the trunk. There's probable cause here for murder times 3,000. And we're to believe that all this needed to be recycled hastily. And by the way, I worked with a person at Fort Hood military base in Killeen, Texas, who actually did this work. He went to New York City as a first responder. He was a first responder. He had training in CPR and so forth. And he told me about the tight controls that they put on him, the GPS installed in his truck. He was 10 minutes late back after he went to the harbor. He was one of those that took the truck to the harbor to have it unloaded into the barges. And he was questioned about being 10 minutes late back to ground zero. He thought it was really alarming that he was micromanaged everywhere he went. Couldn't be late for lunch. Couldn't carry a cell phone. Couldn't do this. Couldn't do that. Highly restricted. This damage should have been taken somewhere inland, laid out, and meticulously combed by all interested in independently investigating and researching what exactly caused this building really to fall. Building 7 fire expert and editor-in-chief of a 125-year-old fire engineering magazine demands to stop destruction of evidence. He said, "Crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China. And astounding ignorance of government and officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation being swept away. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop." Yeah, I agree. If the evidence contradicts the fire hypothesis, get rid of it. Recycle it. The 9/11 Commission report ignores World Trade Center 7. Why? It seems significant to me that on 9/11, a 610-foot building collapsed. You'd think that would be in the 9/11 Commission report. You'd think. Was NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations used? Standard arson investigation. Section 6.5. Important to remember that the conflict of interest should be avoided. Yet who's involved? Government contractors. The usual. I talked to Dr. Kirkpatrick, who led the FEA investigation of World Trade Center 7, and I asked him, how did you create your building geometry? And that's something that you have to do in FEA. You have to create the geometry in a CAD program. I use a Libre. There's Pro-E, there's SolidWorks, there's a lot of them. Garbage in, garbage out applies. I asked him, how'd you create your building model? Did you have plans? Well, we had limited plans. What does that mean? Well, we didn't have everything because everything was destroyed when the buildings were collapsed. Now, those that get involved with these large projects and are involved in building design, are plans archived? Were they microfished? Are they backed up to digital? Oh, yeah. Were they all destroyed when the building collapsed? Oh, I doubt it. This guy wasn't eager to talk to me for very long either. Applied Research Associates led the finite element investigation, and they also worked for the government. A controlled demolition expert tells us you blow out columns from below to get buildings to fall. This is controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. This was professional work. A PhD professor and former chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering of the Swiss Federal Institute said, in my opinion, the World Trade Center 7 was, with great probability, professionally demolished. A structural engineer from UC Berkeley, a localized failure in steel frame buildings like WTC 7 cannot cause catastrophic collapses like a house of cards without simultaneous and pattern loss of several of its columns in key locations within the building. So, foreknowledge. The Deputy Chief Fire announces the imminent collapse. Get back. We're moving this command post out of the way. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We heard the bomb in the building. Eyewitness. By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from the triage. The building 7 was going to come down. Foreknowledge. Who knew? Why didn't they tell everyone? Why did they tell people in the wake just before it came down? How did they know? Police and construction workers, keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris is coming down. BBC announcing. And of course they apologized for it. I'm thankful for that. But they announced 20 minutes prior that the building had collapsed. But there it is. They apologized for this mistake. How could you even make this mistake? It's not possible to make this mistake. So do we have evidence of a controlled demolition? Do we have evidence of chemical reactions? Do we have evidence of extremely high heat sources? Well, who's inside? Oh, the CIA, the Secret Service, the IRS, Department of Defense, Mayor Giuliani's office, Securities Exchange Commission. Could Al-Qaeda have gained access to get in there and do all this work required to get this extremely strong building to fall at near free fall speed? If Building 7 was a controlled demolition, and since the necessary resources and months of planning and execution and planning of explosives requires a conspiracy, and the building was demolished on 9/11, then it is a reasonable assumption that WTC-7 must have been a part of the overall conspiracy of 9/11. And since we've already shown that Al-Qaeda didn't have access to this highly secure building, the conspirators must have been someone who did have such access. Now, this is from NIST, and it's showing these detached columns. Floors breaking through the steel decking, 22-gauge steel decking the bottom, breaking through the girders, holding the floors up, freeing up and then falling. This is the best I have received so far in terms of, oh yeah, these are the plans, these are the blueprints, there you go. No, this won't help. This is nice, shows me where the floor beams are, the girders, shows me where the column locations are, shows me this magic column 79 right there, but I need the plans and specifications to properly model this building in CAD and run what I want to introduce you to. Everyone should know what finite element analysis is. Is it, using Cicero, a sword of Damocles? Maybe. Finite element analysis has been around in the 40s, partially to help us better understand structures and how to design and develop better structures, how to know to use, you can use less material here, you need to use more material here, different material there. These are pictures of finite element analysis method stills, computer-generated images. It was developed 70 years ago, and it involves taking a solid created in a computer CAD, parametric usually, 3D, and then applying a mesh, increasing the resolution of the mesh, making the nodes smaller and smaller and smaller, and then applying initial conditions, events, thermal events, load events, shear events, electric events, and so on and so forth. Definitely not going to read this. But the development of finite element analysis is important here forward. We need the plans, and if we have the plans, we can use FEA to run an infinite amount of simulations to answer this. What's necessary to make a building collapse at free fall speed? Thermal, fire simulation and modeling, as well as structural stress development and/or transfer and impulse dynamic frequency response, finite element method analysis modeling needs to be applied thoroughly to WTC 1, 2, and 7 and structures to understand what is possible and what isn't. There were stresses, and there are stresses inside that building all the time. They're called gravity. The building was designed to withstand gravity, and our development of stress theory has occurred over a couple hundred years. The basic, simple answer to stress is its force over an area. Now, we have particular stresses that give us indication. Rigid body mechanics is one study, and it's your introductory study of engineering, but solid body mechanics is a more difficult study. So we have to look closer at stresses and their tensors. And the man that helped us get there real quick, his name was Richard von Mises, brother of the economist. Arthur von Mises' father had two very smart kids. He should be proud. Most of the stresses that we're concerned with the deformation of materials, are the von Mises stresses. And that's typically the output of FEA, is von Mises stresses. There he is. We have this man to thank for the results of a lot of our FEA finite element analysis work. We want to know how materials deform, and can an office fire radiate enough heat through the fireproofing on steel beams to cause a steel beam to expand enough and therefore break away. How much von Mises stresses will occur at the clip connections between a beam and a column? Is there enough from office fire to make this occurrence? This is the man who developed much of this over 100 years ago, and this is what we have today. And notice the outputs of these analysis, dynamic FEA, von Mises strain, von Mises stresses. Von Mises predicted with tremendous accuracy. Now our FEA software proves him right. Just like modern economic theory may prove Ludwig von Mises to be right in all matters of economics. We can use this in many different applications, medical, showing how a cell phone and its delicate internal parts will hold up over shock studies, drop studies, and so on and so forth. Will it take a 10-foot drop? Will it take a 100-foot drop? Can we drop it from the top of a tall building, and will that phone be okay? Well, we can find all of that out without dropping an actual phone. We can do it in software now. That's good. So we can also take that building, recreate that building in CAD if we can get the plans and specifications and do an infinite amount of finite element analysis simulations. Let's drop a magic amount of weight, 1,000,000 pounds on the building, 1,000 pounds on the building, 100 million pounds in the building, and see what happens. Let's take some columns out, do the same thing, see what happens. Let's put some fires inside the building, create heat sources, take some columns out, see what happens. Ultimately, we can get to the bottom of what it will take to make a building fall at free fall speed. This is quickly how the process is done. You take a solid, you create it in CAD software, you throw a mesh on it. You can throw a finer mesh on it with more nodes. The more nodes, the more computer power you will need. You can set initial surface conditions. I'm going to fix it here. I'm going to pin it here. I'm going to hinge it here, whatever. And you can put loads on it. You can put heat sources near it. You can do an infinite amount of things to recreate real world events. And then you can get the results. I see. The highest stress point is right here, right here. Maybe with 10,000 pounds, I need to put a stiffener plate right here. Maybe I don't need all this material here. Whatever. You can make all these design considerations with software, but we need the plans. We need the construction plans to accurately represent the building. Otherwise, we'll get the criticism of, well, without the plans, you don't know. So then we have to make assumptions, which weakens our argument. Now, this is just a crude little sketch I drew of the magic column 79 that broke free. And I just want to illustrate the point. We have to look at the clip connections, the clip tables, the bolted connections, so on and so forth. Without that, we can guess. And we can still recreate this building, and we can still run simulations. Let me show you the government's NIST simulation. Here it goes. And they're saying, Dr. Kirkpatrick told me that a lot of internal damage happened inside first. And then does that match what really
It's gone, man.
Sorry about the expletive. Look at it again. Did that match the computer simulation? This is the finite element analysis. Now I showed you slides of what a finite element analysis looks like. And does it match? No, it doesn't match. These floor beams right here going across are all attached to these other floor beams. And they're all attached to this column. And they're attached to the concrete. They're attached to the rebar. They're attached, they're attached, they're attached. And we got this report saying they suddenly became free. Well, how does that happen? Can that happen? Okay, here's some construction plans, and this is what I want. Because I want others and myself to recreate this building in computer software and run simulations. These are what plans and specs are. Now, the plans and specs that came out from WTC 1 and 2 that I argued with Jason Burmis, a guy I respect and like, he said, oh yeah, the plans are out. No, they're not. Plans and specs will have a signature and a stamp by an architect and an engineer, and they'll have a date, and they'll have a signature. We don't have that. We don't have that for Building 7, and we need that. We don't have that for Building 1 and WTC 1 and 2, and we need those. We need the construction materials testing reports. We need the submittals. We need the RFIs, requests for information. We need the welding inspection reports. We need all that stuff. We need the materials mill reports for the steel. We need the concrete mix design for the concrete. We need all that. And we can figure out what it'll take to destroy these structures in the manner they were destroyed. We can do that. These are some typical examples of what I see in my daily life. Doing inspections, working through problems, and when you build a steel frame building, there's a nest of problems. These are usually how connections are made, with a combination of bolts, welds, bar joists, or a combination thereof. This is what you'll typically see. And somehow all this broke loose at column 79 from an office fire. Turn of the nut method, tightening a bolt to a full tension position, turns it 1/3 past the contact. Past the full ply contact. Snug tight, then 1/3 beyond. See this worker. Several inches, member welded up, many weld passes. Heat transfer. All this gobbledygook means that heat will convect. Heat will also radiate. Heat will also conduct. And we can do that too in finite element analysis. We can figure out how much fire will it take to get through the suspended ceiling floor tile, get through the concrete deck, and get to that magic column 79 and make it break apart. We can figure out how much fire will do that. I can tell you right now, my hypothesis, it'll take a volcano from the center of the earth to come up inside that building. Another picture of finite element. So this is part of the NIST report from last year. And they're telling me to believe this. Derek, you must believe this. Push the I believe button. The initial local failure began. The probable WTC7 collapse sequence was the buckling of column 79. This buckling arose from a process that occurred at temperatures at or below approximately 750 degrees. The melting temperature is 2750, which are well below the temperatures considered in current practice for determining fire-resistant ratings associated with significant loss of steel strength. When steel or other metal is heated, it expands. If the thermal expansion in steels is resisted by the columns or other steel members, forces develop in the structural members that can cause bucklings of beams or failures of connections. Can office fires break away structural members such as this? Can office fires break this away? No. Never. More from this report from the experts. Fire-induced thermal expansion of floor systems surrounding column 79 led to the collapse of floor 13. That's where it started. We can prove that's impossible. We need the plans. Which triggered the cascade of floor failures somehow. In this case, the floor beams on the east side of building expanded enough that they pushed the girder spanning between columns 79 and 44 to the west on the 13th floor. See figure 1.5. The unsupported girder and other local fire-induced damage caused floor 13 to collapse, beginning a cascade of floor failures down to the 5th floor through members that are 1,000 pounds per foot of structural steel, the ultimate building material. Many of these floors had already been at least partially weakened by the fires in the vicinity of column 79. This left column 79 with insufficient lateral support as a consequence, and the column buckled eastward, becoming the initial local failure for collapse initiation. Oh yeah? Let me see the finite element analysis. Let me run my own simulation. Let me verify that, please. Due to the buckling of column 79 between floor 5 and 14, the upper section of column 79 began to descend. The downward movement of column 79 led to the observed kink in the east penthouse and its subsequent descent. The cascading failures of the lower floors surrounding column 79 led to increased unsupported length in falling debris impacted upon and loads being redistributed to adjacent columns, and column 80 and then 81 buckled as well. All the floor connections, I love the word all, to these three columns as well as the exterior columns failed, and the floors fell on the east side of the building. The exterior facade of the east quarter of the building was just a hollow shell. So all this happened, all this damage happened, starting with the initiation from an office fire. The failure of according to this, the failure of the internal columns then proceeded towards the west. Truss 2 failed, hit by the debris from the falling floors. This caused column 77 and column 78 to fail, followed shortly by column 76. Never mind these members, these structural members are an inch thick, and they're welded, and they have a strength of 80,000 pounds per square inch, sometimes many dozens of bolts, literally hundreds of thousands of bolts in this. They all failed from an office fire. which tended to push the columns westward and the loads redistributed to them from the buckled columns. Within seconds, the entire building core was buckling. The global collapse of WTC-7 was underway. The shell of exterior columns buckled between the 7th and 14th floors as loads were redistributed to these columns due to the downward movement of the building core and floors. The entire building above the buckled column region then moved downward as a single unit, completing the global collapse sequence. In other words, a miracle happened. Well, this is what each deck has. Lots and lots of rebar, reinforcement steel, tough stuff, designed to linearly expand and contract in the same manner that concrete does. Worked out well that way. Well, all these floors here are just giving way. They have rebar in them every 12 inches, both ways, and they're just falling. An office fire caused the detachment. They just fell. Everything just fell. It cascaded. It just fell. Believe that. So here's two more of these FEA. I showed you a little bit what an FEA is, and they're telling me this is FEA. No, this is a visualization of what you want to see, and it's not even a good one at that. And here's their visualization, finite element analysis of the structure with initial damage, presumably damage to that southwest corner that you would think would cause the building to lean or favor its injury. Now, finite element analysis needs to be applied independently by interested students, young people, middle-aged people, old people, Catholics, Jews, atheists, anarchists, everyone concerned with the crime of the murder of 3 million people. It can be done. Too few inside the truth movement are talking about it. No, most people don't know to talk about finite element method analysis, what it is, what it can do, how it can solve this, how it can get to the bottom of this and make what we're told to believe even less believable than it already is. Once again, why? Well, this is what drives me. This is what will always drive me. Truth. So truth fails, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. In other words, go along with the world, what the world wants. Then the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. Perhaps our greatest prophet ever, Isaiah. Again, the secular view of why we should be concerned about this. Society lives and acts only in individuals. Forget about collectivism. Von Mises and Rothbard and Hayek debunked Karl Marx. It is nothing more than a certain attitude on their part, individuals, me, you. Everyone carries the part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others. And no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone in his own interest must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcerned. The interests of everyone hang in the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, that the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. Solutions. Get the contract documents. Get the construction plans. Get the blueprints. Get the project specifications, the materials testing reports, the mill reports, the submittals, the concrete mix design, requests for information, RFIs, bid documents, welder certification, minutes from construction meetings, and so on. They're out there. They exist. Get them. Contact those who may have information with regards to the WTC structures. ARA, Albuquerque, New Mexico. They talk to me, they'll talk to you. Ask Dr. Kirkpatrick, how did you do a finite element method analysis and lead a team doing the same thing without the contract plans and specifications, and why should we believe you? Where are the contract plans and documents? Tishman Construction. Oh, they love to take calls, but they do not love to talk about World Trade Center 7. Richard Lee Roth, grandson of the architect, thought that my inquiry to wanting to know where the World Trade Center plans and specifications was funny. Oh, it was funny. He just laughed. I just asked. He just laughed. So funny. Funny, funny. War in Iraq, war in Afghanistan. Lots of people dead. Funny. Muser, Rutledge Consultants, they do what I do. Geotech engineering, environmental engineering, steel testing, consulting, and so forth. They didn't call me back. Silverstein Properties, they talked to me, but then when I announced what I was calling about, said, we'll call you back. Never called me back. Perform and support independently sponsored 9/11 investigations. If you think the government is going to raise money and spend taxpayer money to support an investigation that's going to indict themselves, think again. Including finite element analysis method surveys that are subject to peer review and criticism. I want to see your FEA. I'll show you my FEA. I want to see your model of the building geometry. I want to run some different simulations that you didn't consider. Take this column out, take that column out, take these columns out, then run your simulation. Put more heat into it. Put more hypothetical weight on top of it. Reduce the size of the members. Increase the size of the members, and on and on. Continue to ask questions with regards to the official 9/11 story trademark. Thank you very much. I appreciate y'all's time. I appreciate it very much. You can contact me if you want to. Thank you. And the question was how much thermites the pre-reaction, and then thermites the post-reaction, if I understand the technology, and how would it be applied. I don't know how much thermite, as one of my chemistry teachers used to tell me in college, enough. You need enough to complete the reaction. So I do not know how much thermite was introduced. With as much molten steel as we've seen, and as for as long as we saw molten steel, they had fires beneath the ground floor until December. I would assume a lot. Now, as far as your second question, and I'm sorry, I don't know how much thermite was used, although I do know there is strong evidence of thermite, that thermite was in fact used. Now, to your second question of how would you use the steel, I would put it at the most compromising slip angle, and that's at 45 degrees. Now, there is testimony of 45-degree cuts in the cleanup site. So if I were to try to bring a building down, I would place it at 45 degrees on the columns. Well, I would assume that the charges were ignited electrically, absolutely. I mean, RF's a possibility, but I would lean towards wiring the building and letting if this nanothermite was used, which is a gel form, then what would make sense to me was ignite it with some sort of electronics or ignition. I know high heat has to be initiated unless the technology has changed since the development in the late 19th century. But I would ignite it simultaneously. I would think so. And those explosions, you would think would, once the thermite does its dirty deed, you think those explosions would be necessary to initiate the removal of the lower structural material from the upper structural material. Yes, sir. Okay, the question was, do we really need the plans? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you want to achieve. If I want to achieve an accurate representation of the building, then yes, and that's my intention, and that's my goal of my presentation, is to induce others to ask for those plans, because I believe they exist, whether they're microfished, whether they're stored electronically, whatever. I want those to fall from protected hands into public hands, because I simply do not believe that they were all destroyed. Now, yes, the backup is, can we, by conjecture and our standard practice of care, which we call our rules, can we recreate this building? Do we have enough to recreate this building? Are we going to use 3,000 PSI concrete and grade 40 rebar and 22 gauge deck and all that? Yes, absolutely. But my first choice is having the contract documents, because then I can defeat immediately the argument of, well, that's not a faithful model. You see, the building really had this or that, or you can't get what the building really had, therefore you'll never be able to know. So that's why, yes, I really want to strive and get other people to call and email and write and visit to ask for those contract plans and documents because they're out there and we need them. And with them, we can make a closer representation of what really happened. Things change over time, and those girders don't always line up. There's fit-up problems in the field. There are changes because bolt holes don't line up when you go to put clip connections in from beams to columns and so on and so forth, so stuff happens. And a lot of times building construction professionals they'll sin and ask for forgiveness after the fact. What that means, they'll do what they want to do, and then they'll shoot the engineer an email or call him and say, hey, I got in a jam, my guys have to finish, my bonus is on the line and all this is what I did. Either you bless it or make me do something else or punish me. And if the engineer and the building professional have a relationship, most likely the engineer's either going to say, okay, you do that, but you need to also do this, or okay, I trust you, I like what you did, what you did was fine, but it has to be put in writing, and that's why I want those RFIs. I want to see the anomalies, but yeah, we can make those assumptions, but those assumptions compromise the integrity of our investigation. The question is how difficult and how long and how much would it cost to do a real 9/11 investigation, because as of this date, July 11, 2009, we have not had a real 9/11 investigation, and that is a lot of money. And what we have to understand is, can we put this on the taxpayer? Can we expect the taxpayer to fork over all the money to do this when we're, knowing full well it's going to be a sham? How long? Years. How much? A lot. But what I want to inspire in others is to have the passion to know how to take the safe route, the only route from the 6th floor to the ground floor. Now, what we've been doing so far, and using just one analogy, and then I've got to take it outside because I don't want to take up Dr. Bowman's question, but what we're doing right now is we're jumping out of the 6th floor. And we're making it to the ground, but we're getting hurt. And I'm saying, go down the elevator or take the stairs. And people are still jumping out of the 6th floor window because they want to get to the bottom, but they're jumping out the window. I'm saying the only way safe to the ground, and by safe, in my weak metaphor, is to get the public to understand what happened this day couldn't really happen. There's no way. It's impossible. The only safe way we can do this is with recreating the building with computer software accurately, making all the assumptions and predictions that contractors will make during the normal construction of a building in their standard practice of care, and then running a multitude of simulations from initial events, thermal events, structural damage, imagining lots of beams fell on the building, lots of extremely heavy beams, and then arriving after many simulations of how impossible it really is to get a structure like that to fall. Hope that answered your question. Thank you, everyone. If anyone else has any questions, I'll talk to you as long as you want to talk outside. Thanks again.